Thank you guys so much for being here today. I'm Jamie Brightman. I'm one of the college advisors here at Deerfield, and I'm here tonight with Ben Neely, who's the Chief of Research and Impact Officer at Revolution Prep. And I'm going to really let Ben drive most of the time here because he's there. They've done tons of good research, and I'm really grateful for them being here tonight to share it with us. So I'm just going to kind of like introduce things, talk a little bit about how the college advising timeline works, but really tonight is about some stuff that is helpful for you to know about the standardized testing landscape as you sort of look forward at that as you're kind of coming up upon it. So we can go ahead and get started. Great. So the first thing, like I said, I'm really going to let Ben sort of take most of the spotlight here. But I did want to just give you a little bit of a sense of the Deerfield timeline for college advising. Definitely one of the things we'll talk about through the whole thing is testing and test prep and helping kids think about a strategy and a timeline for testing. So I just wanted to give you some of the other kind of big headline things that we do in college advising and the timeline for that. You can find a really detailed timeline on the college advising website. So if you go to the bulletin, you can find it there. So in 10th grade, like in usually January or February, we have a full grade meeting with the 10th graders, really just to introduce some of these concepts and introduce them to our office. And through February, we offer these ad hoc one-on-one meetings that a lot of sophomores do take us up on. In November of their junior year, you'll get assigned a college advisor from the college advising office. We'll start to get to know your kids. We'll have some meetings with them. We'll start to ask them about the kinds of things that they're interested in for college. And then in February and March, usually right around that timeline, based on all of those things that we've learned about your student and the colleges that they might be interested in, we give a big list of suggested colleges, and then we sort of let students, we give them tips for researching. They start the research process on those schools. Over the summer, before they start their senior year, that's when they're really starting that application work, writing essays. Again, they're continuing to do college research. We're here for them during that time. We encourage them to be sending us those drafts, making appointments with us to Zoom if they would like to. And then when they come back, they're really working hard on finishing up those applications. Early apps are usually due November 1 or thereabout. And then regular decision applications are due in January. Again, we're just supporting them that whole time. There's obviously a lot of other details that goes into it, but I just wanted to give you that kind of general timeline for how college advising works at Deerfield. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ben so he can sort of talk you through the standardized testing landscape.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. My pleasure to be here. I've been able to speak to Deerfield families before. So if any of you happen to be here last year, then some of this will be similar. There's been change, but there hasn't been that much change in the last year. Just really quickly about Revolution Prep, we're an online learning company. We've been around for about 22 years now. I've been working for them for 15 years. We do all of our work online, not because of COVID or any of those sort of changes. We made that switch back in 2013, and our mission is to transform lives. So more than just working on a test, we love to inspire and to mentor kids to be their best learner. Four sort of things we're going to talk through today that really fit into two themes. The first is around testing policy changes. So I'm sure you've heard a lot about this in the last year or 2 years. Maybe you have an older sibling than your ninth or 10th grader, but we'll talk about what has happened with test optional, test free, test required. And then we'll dig into the digital SAT and PSAT. What has changed in that? How does that impact, or how should that impact what students are doing to prepare themselves as optimally as possible? So we'll dig into that. Then we'll kind of mush it all together into a discussion around making a good testing plan and how that should be a unique thing for each and every one of your children. There is no one size fit all, but there are some good best practices, some good guidelines that we will talk about that go into that. Couple housekeeping notes, because these are usually the very first questions that get asked. One, is this session being recorded? Yes. And will it be shared with you? Yes. So no need to take pictures of your laptop or take notes. You will have access to this full recording with all of these slides. You can speed me up into 2 times if you think I'm going too slowly, or slow me down. make my voice sound really funny, you'll have that prerogative. You can also share this video link with anybody. So if you have a kiddo that you think should see this, or a friend or a relative or anybody else, they'll be able to see it. The other question is about questions. So Q&A, if you want to take a minute and find the little icon that looks like two speech bubbles and it says Q&A, that is the best place to ask questions. My remarks will be about 40 minutes or so, and I will make sure I leave at least 10 minutes at the end to answer questions. By using that Q&A, it puts them into a handy little queue where I can see them. You're also, I believe you should be able to ask those questions anonymously. If you're not comfortable having your name on them, that's fine. So would love it if everybody here made ample use of that. I'm always a dangerous thing to say, but bring it on. Bring on the questions as we go. So first things first, let's talk about testing policies and how that change has happened. Now, I like to start with the basics. For some of you, you may already know all of this, so bear with me. We'll get to some things maybe you don't know in a minute, but to make sure we're all on the same page, 99% of colleges and universities are going to have one of these three policies around standardized testing as part of their admissions process. They are either going to be test required, probably something we are most familiar with, which is in order to apply, you must submit an SAT or ACT score, interchangeable. So that's test required. That was the way of the past. Test optional, also sort of what it sounds like. The applicant has the option. They can include a test score if they like. They can also apply without a test score. And either of those is a valid process to apply to a test optional school. And then finally, test free. You've probably also heard this referred to as test blind. I think for the colleges, the test free is their preferred nomenclature. This is, it doesn't matter if you have a perfect score and you're very proud of it. There is no place to include a score in the application if you're applying to a test-free school. So there are some very, very minor variations on these overall, but really every college or university is going to fall into one of these three buckets. Now, test required and test free are pretty straightforward to understand. There is no vagueness, there is no ambiguity. Test required is you must, and test free is you shan't, right? So those are both very straightforward. Test optional is where it gets a little bit nuanced. And I think the first thing people assume when they hear me speak about this, they're like, you're a test prep guy, you've been doing this for 20 years. You must hate test optional. You must rue the day that they made that change. And I don't. I actually think it's a positive change in the vast majority of situations. I will say the one minor drawback, and the thing that I like to educate students and parents on, is the nuance of it. A lot of folks just say test optional, super simple. You just have the option, no big deal. In reality, in observation, it turns out that there's about 4 or 5 different flavors of test optional, probably more than that, to be honest, but you can kind of group folks. So in terms of fraction, test free, while it might be the policy that a lot of teenagers wish was the case everywhere, is only about 4% of colleges and universities. Test optional, which I will say encompasses these next 5, is basically the law of the land. That is 85% of colleges and universities that are 4-year undergraduate institutions are test optional. So odds are good when your son or daughter, eventually gets to that finalized college list, the majority of the schools they're applying to will probably be test optional. And within that, you have a lot of flavors. You have everything from what I will call true optional. This could be some schools like University of Chicago or Bowdoin, Bates, where either they have been test optional for a long time now, or they are really explicit in their language around test optional, that they are going to do test optional in a way that is most beneficial to your son or daughter. And what I mean by that is, if they don't submit a test score, they're not going to make any assumptions about your applicant. They're going to say, hey, no test score, no big deal. We will not presume anything that maybe they didn't have a good score and that's why. We're just going to say that's cool, no test score, no big deal. So there are some optional schools that behave that way. We'll call them true optional. This next category is, I would say, there are more schools that fit into the not required but recommended category. So these are schools that are test optional and your application is valid without it, but that admissions department would like to see a test score if you can muster one up. They recommend it. In some cases, they will specify that in the language on their website. In other cases, they don't, but we can infer it from their behavior in terms of previous classes around test optional. So that's another one. Then you have test flexible. These are some schools where they're test optional if you fit certain criteria. Auburn, good example. If you have at least a 3.5 GPA, then you are allowed to apply test optional to Auburn. If your GPA is below that, then they are test required. You also have some schools like Yale, who is now flexible where you don't have to submit an SAT or ACT. You could use AP or IB scores instead. So there's just a lot of variance on this. And I think that's where some students and parents kind of get tripped up a little bit, is viewing it as one size fits all, when it really is a process where you're going to work with, and your child is going to work with their Deerfield College advisor to understand that on a case by case basis. And it really isn't just about the school, it's about your son or daughter's overall application as well, in terms of understanding how testing may or may not be the right thing to submit for each of those optional schools. Finally, test required about 11%. So you're not misreading that. It is the case that right now, only about 1 in 10 colleges in this country require an SAT or ACT score. Very, very different. I will not make any presumptions about when all of you might have applied to college, but I know when I did, it was not 10%. It was about 95% of colleges and universities that required the test. Now, one common misconception, a lot of folks think that COVID was the start of all of this, and that before that, nobody was test optional. Now everybody is. This graph is showing us year by year the progression. And you can see that even before COVID in 2019, you had almost 50% of the colleges and universities in this country were already test optional. That being said, we did see a substantial jump up in large parts of the country, especially my home state of California. It was about 16 months until you could actually reasonably get a test site for SAT or ACT. So that sparked a lot of that shift. That being said, it has really held on since then. So we have not seen many colleges or universities return to requiring. We'll talk about a couple exceptions in a minute, but for the most part, those schools have stayed there. The reality is, admissions offices and enrollment management offices at colleges and universities have wanted to be test optional for a long time for various reasons. Some of them pure and altruistic and good meaning. Others, playing the numbers game a little bit around applicants and around interest in their college, right? And some mixture thereof. So not a real surprise that they've stayed there. Now that the door was opened a little bit, they've really kind of hold it open in that way. I think the reason there are a lot of students or parents who think that COVID created this switch, and that before it there were very few and now there's everybody, is there is a specific subset of the most selective colleges and universities where COVID really did represent a stark change amongst that set of colleges. And so for shorthand, I'm using the US News Top 50 National and Top 25 Liberal Arts. To be clear, please do not take this as an endorsement in any way of the US News rankings. I think they actually cause a lot more harm and confusion than they ever help most applicants, but they are a good shorthand for a guy who's making a slide. So amongst those most selective schools with the lowest admit rates, almost none of them were test optional before COVID. You had only 13%. We've now seen an exact inversion since COVID in that policy. So I think this dynamic is why a lot of students and parents think that COVID kind of created the test optional change, even though there were many less selective institutions who were already optional before that. It's such a stark shift for these 75 schools, that I can show you on this one slide that these were the only 10 schools that were optional before COVID on the left of those 75. And now on the right, these are the only 12 who are requiring this fall out of those 75. Now, I mentioned earlier a small handful of colleges and universities who went optional that have returned. Several of them are on this list on the right: MIT, Dartmouth, Brown, Yale, Georgetown, Georgia Tech, UGA. All of the schools I just mentioned did go optional for 1 or more years. Most recently, you have Dartmouth, Brown, and Yale this spring who returned to requiring. I think there have been a lot of parents and students who have maybe over correlated or overblown that shift, and they're like, oh, that's the first few dominoes and now everyone's going to return to requiring. I don't think that's the case. I think it's, Columbia, for example, made their policy permanent. Harvard extended theirs. Stanford has extended theirs at least once. So I think there will be more that return to requiring, most likely next year, maybe one or two more this year, but it's getting a little late for that announcement for this fall. So I think you'll have a handful more next year. But for the most part, test optional is a have your cake and eat it too policy for the admissions departments. They have some internal pushback in some institutions from their faculty or from trustees, board presidents, donors. It depends on the school. Some schools don't have that. They love test optional. So that's the dynamic. But if you ask just the admissions officers at most of these schools, they would love to stay test optional. That would be their preference. So there's that. Now, test free, not as big of a deal. That being said, it was almost non-existent before COVID. Interestingly, the shift to test free that was the biggest is from the University of California, here, actually my alma mater, and the California State University system, and had nothing to do with COVID. It had to do with a lawsuit. So that was a whole different thing. But coincidentally, it happened in 2020 when they were already looking at that sort of thing. This slide asks a question that is a little bit inside baseball, a little bit deep cut for testing nerds like me. But if you have watched the world of testing policy for the last few decades, the University of California has been a harbinger. So when they have made big, significant changes, within 5 to 10 years, everybody else has followed. So, for example, they were the first to say, hey, there's this timed SAT essay and this ACT essay. We don't want that. We're not going to consider that. And within 10 years, not only did everybody else stop, but now the SAT doesn't even offer the timed essay anymore. They were the first to say, we don't want the SAT subject tests, the SAT 2s, and now those are gone. So it's, I think, a reasonable question to ask, but I think the answer in this case is pretty clearly no. We are not going to see a bunch of test optional schools moving to test free. It's a numbers game where you have a lot of applicants and few spaces, and more information, even if it's optional information, tends to be, I think, a good thing for those schools. I think the other reason we're not going to see them abandon testing entirely and go test free is this slide, which is tracking year by year what percentage of incoming college freshmen reported having at least a 3.4 unweighted GPA while they were in high school. And this data set goes back to the 1960s. This is out of UCLA. They've been asking the same question every year for 60 years, which is pretty impressive in and of itself. And you can see, as I'll use myself as an example, I graduated high school vaguely somewhere in this range here, let's just say. And it was less common than not back in the 90s that a high school student who was heading off to college said they had a 3.4 GPA. That was, kind of a differentiating thing. Fast forward to the most recent data we have that just came out from 2022. Now 81% of high school students have that GPA. So you've heard the term grade inflation. I think that can be a little bit of a coarse or inaccurate term, but it is accurate to say that the distribution of student grade performance has changed over the last 30 years. So if you're a selective college who's thinking about differentiating between students, GPA just isn't as information rich as it once was. Don't get me wrong, still the number one most impactful factor, or really number one and two, would be the grades as well as the relative rigor of that coursework. So those are still king and queen, and that's not changing, but it's just not as separating as it used to be. So I do think schools are going to still want to be able to at least give the option for students to include a test score as part of that. Finally, sort of the million-dollar question we get asked a lot is, well, how is my son or daughter going to navigate this if they have 6 or 7 schools they're applying to that are test optional? And the great news for you is you have an expert college advisor that will be assigned at Deerfield, which is huge. My son goes to Santa Monica High School here, and I can tell you there is zero support for whether he should or shouldn't. It's going to be his dad trying to butt his nose in and see if he can add some value for his son's process from I have a high school junior right now. So I think that's the answer to this question. It is nuanced. It is not as simple as I heard this or I heard that. And really, Jamie and the rest of the advisors have a great finger on the pulse of this, as well as internal information about past Deerfield applicants who may have similar profiles as an applicant overall to a similar school. So really that's the good news there, is it'll be a case by case discussion and you're going to have that support at Deerfield, which is, I think, really, really fantastic. All right. Happy to take any questions on testing policy. Let's move on to the tests themselves, the SAT, the ACT, what is happening with these tests, the digital version. I already see some great questions in the Q&A, so thank you. Keep those coming. I see them, and I will get to them. So we are in a moment of significant change for the SAT and the PSAT. So for the first time in 80, 90 years of this test, it is no longer offered in a pencil and paper format. It is now in a mandatory digital format. And this first rolled out, this first manifested in the PSAT last October, and now in the first national test date for the SAT, which was last month on March 9th. And it continues ongoing. My son just took it via, at his school today. So it is fully digital now. There is no more option for students to choose a paper version. Not that they should if they had that option. And in terms of what's changing, let me give you another kind of bias check real quick. You might presume, okay, again, test prep nerd, he probably loves all tests. And so therefore, of course, he's going to say that everything's great. The folks who make this test, College Board, have a long and illustrious history of, I'm trying to think of the right euphemism, stepping on their own toes, or whatever the more colorful ones I could use. They've made a lot of mistakes over the years, and those mistakes in some cases maybe were intentional and some were unintentional, but they don't have a great track record when they have reinvented their test. And this is the third time they're doing this in the last 17 years. And I have been very open and free in sharing with parents and students when I think they've made mistakes. So all of that to say, I am not a shill for them, and I'm about to be effusive in my praise for this test because I actually think it is, for maybe the first time in their history, a really good redesign of the test. But just know that I'm not being paid off by them at all. And it, in fact, is sort of shocking to me that they've done this good of a job on this test. So it is on a device. It is the student's own device that they are supplying. So if they go take a national SAT test date, they don't just walk into a computer center. They have to bring their own laptop or iPad or what have you. I suppose they could bring a desktop computer, be a little bit unwieldy. The test is shorter, and that's the most meaningful change in many ways for students that are doing this test. It is a 30% reduction in testing time, and that is huge. It's still a long test, but it is getting closer to a length which is similar to what your son or daughter might see in a final exam or a midterm exam at Deerfield. So it's getting closer. In order to get that test shortening without sacrificing any accuracy or consistency in how the test is built, they are making it digital adaptive. So that is a means to an end. It turns out, this is old science, we'll talk more about it in a few slides, if you use this digital adaptivity where the test changes as you take it, gets a little harder, gets a little easier, then you need fewer questions to get to the same level of accuracy in your assessment. So they aren't just doing digital adaptive because they like it. It is their means to shorten the test without losing accuracy. There's a few other changes, pretty minor. What hasn't changed? Same scoring scale. So if you took the SAT in the 90s or the 80s, it was 400 to 1600. It's still 400 to 1600. The math content hasn't really shifted much with this. There's more changes on the reading and writing side. The test dates, the test experience is the same. I've had some parents that are like, oh, is it proctored at home now over Zoom? Are kids putting on their Apple Vision Pros and they're taking the test in virtual reality? No, the testing experience is actually still remarkably similar to what we all probably experienced, which is, a bunch of nervous, sweaty teenagers and the, air conditioning unit or the heating unit is making a screeching sound, which is distracting you, and the girl you have a crush on is sitting over right next to you, of course. So all of those factors that we lovingly remember from when we took the test are still the same thing, even though it's on a computer. There's still scratch paper. You still use a graphing calculator if you want to bring your calculator. So there's still a proctor, right? So all of that is really, really similar. In terms of comparing to the other big option tester, which is the ACT, you might have heard me mention a bunch of times earlier, for all the testing policies, you can submit either an SAT or an ACT. These tests are interchangeable for college admissions. So any college that accepts these tests, they don't care. Still, the myth persists that there are certain schools that prefer ACT or SAT. Just not true. There are many of them that actually will convert the scores onto a single scale before a meaningful part of the reading process even happens. So they really don't care. They are the Coca-Cola and Pepsi of testing. Now, prior to this digital change, the two tests had actually grown quite similar, but now they are quite distinct once again. Duration is the one that jumps out the most. So you're talking about spending 3 hours versus 2 hours and 15 minutes. Pretty big difference in terms of time spent. Score range is meaningless. Those are just numbers assigned to a performance. The content covered is actually pretty similar. We'll talk about a couple little differences, but it's all a lot of, sort of math and reading and English grammar proficiency from grades 6 through 11, basically, is what they're looking at. Where you do start to see a big difference is this science section on the ACT. I will air quote it for you. It's not actual science knowledge, so there's no chemistry or physics or biology. It is basically passages that have charts and graphs, more or less. The other big difference is those passages on the ACT are long. I'm sure we all remember fondly reading this massive, 7-paragraph essay about something super exciting like the, migratory patterns of North African mealworms after the equinox or what have you. And then you have to answer like 13 questions where you have to keep going back. That is still the case on the ACT, but on the digital SAT, every single question now has its own little bite-sized 100-word passage. And you might imagine for the average attention span of today's teenagers, they're fond of that. The idea that I just have to read 100 words, answer a question, and move on fits very well with a lot of how the most popular social media apps are designed right now. So that's been a popular change as well. In terms of deciding between the two, the correct process is to take a full-length practice test of each. You could also use the PSAT score as a pretty good stand-in for the SAT score and then just take a full-length ACT. Right now, I am seeing a lot of students who are deciding, and I'm sure you're not surprised to hear this, but they're deciding just based on the fact that the SAT is shorter. They're like, duh, no brainer. Why would I take the longer test? That is not an ideal decision-making process. So I still recommend that students do a full-length practice test. Even though the ACT is longer, there are some students, it's a minority, who will score better on the ACT, in which case they're doing themselves a big disservice if they, eliminate it from their decision process. Other things to think about, ACT has 4 sections, so the math is only a quarter of the weighting overall in that composite, whereas for the SAT, it is half of the score. So for any students that are disproportionately stronger or weaker in math, that could be something to think about. Either hiding the math score or diluting the math score or featuring it. And then the other sort of big difference is in test construction and how they make students get questions wrong. Make no mistake, that is the job of the standardized test designer, is actually, I need to have enough students get enough questions wrong. If I don't do that, then the test is not useful to differentiate between students. And so how they do that is actually fairly different between ACT and SAT. ACT likes to put students under significant time pressure where you're really rushing to get it done on a time, but the questions are phrased in a way that is more straightforward critical thinking skills, easier critical thinking skills. SAT gives you a lot more time, but the questions are much more involved. And to sort of show you that difference in a chart, it's really big now. So on average, comparing the questions on the ACT to the similar questions on the SAT, you have 60% more time per question on the SAT versus the ACT. That is huge when you spread that out across a whole test. That being said, if you only decided on that and you didn't look at, let's say, a sample geometry question from the SAT, where students have to juggle the equation of a parabola with a linear equation, the fact that the constant could shift and the two function graphs are intersecting. Again, nothing sort of gimmicky here, just many different parts, right? So they have to synthesize all that different knowledge together and navigate that. That's SAT, but they'll give you 96 seconds on average for that question. ACT says, hey, do you remember how to do slope? Rise over run, baby. Delta Y over delta X, and then compute that using these coordinates, but do it really fast, and you're under such time pressure that you might make a simple mistake, right? So two different ways that the tests are looking to make students miss. I will answer one of the questions I saw just now because I saw it. Is there an essay portion on the digital SAT test? The answer is generally speaking, no. I say generally speaking because there are a small handful of states that use the SAT as their state standardized test for public school students. So in Deerfield, this would not be a thing at all, but in some rare cases, there is a version of the SAT that has an essay. But for the vast majority of students, and certainly for Deerfield students, no, there is no essay, timed essay as part of the SAT. It is still offered as an option for the ACT. We are down to four, count them, four colleges and universities in the United States out of over 2,000 that want the ACT timed essay. So, and they are not schools that your kids are likely to go to. It's like Martin Luther in Minnesota, Soka University in Irvine, the Marine Academy, I think it is, or West Point, I forget which one of the service academies. That's it. And by the way, at all those schools, you can choose to take the SAT instead, which doesn't have an essay. So when in doubt, your kids should not be taking the ACT essay. Essays are basically, timed essays on these tests are dead. But I will see, that was a good question. And then while I'm here, I'll answer another one, which is, can I share my thoughts on pros and cons for paper ACT versus digital SAT for students that might have accommodations such as ADHD or who have extended time accommodation? It is true that given that the primary difficulty sort of lever, or one of them on the ACT, is putting students under that time crunch, students that have applied for and have approved accommodations such as extended time may find the ACT to be a favorable test. You still really need to take both tests in the correct timing that you're approved for and then compare. I would not assume that would be the case, but yes, we have seen that dynamic happen before with the ACT. So, and then I see lots, by the way, these questions are awesome. Keep them coming. I will get to the other ones, but I wanted to hit a couple where they kind of fit as I go, but I'll get to the other ones as we go. So I mentioned the College Board has had a bad history of doing this. They've changed a bunch of times in the last 17 years, third change since 2005. Why would they risk all of this? The big answer is this one on the left. They are trying to make this test, I used to say, more student friendly. In fact, it says on the slide. I've been corrected by students such as my own teenager. He's like, Dad, no test will ever be friendly to a child. So less unfriendly would be the better way to put this. They have seen in large parts of the country, such as Massachusetts or California, a 60% decrease in the number of unique students taking the SAT since COVID. So those testing policy shifts, as well as for a time availability to get a test, really put a big hurt on the College Board's main product that they sell, which is the SAT. So the reason they're making this change is mostly to try to appeal to kids and say, hey, we made it shorter, we put it on a computer, we made the passages, TikTok length, come on back and take the test. That's the main thing. This other stuff is sort of smaller, but sort of part of the equation as well. Okay, so what, you're saying? Interesting changes, interesting to talk about the why. What does this mean for our kids? So I will now answer one of the questions, which was adaptive. So I'll just click answer live because I'm answering this now. So we're all familiar with linear tests that do not change, like a paper test above. This is how the ACT still is. This is how the SAT used to be. Everybody gets the same questions in the same order. If you were unscrupulous, you could look over at your neighbor's test and copy off them. I know none of you would ever do that, but you could. And the test just is what it is. On an adaptive test, a digital adaptive test, and I'm going to use as an example the GRE, the General Graduate School Admissions Test, the GMAT, the Business School Admissions Test. They have been digital adaptive for decades now. How you perform on the test changes what question or questions you might get served next. So, for example, on the GMAT, a test I have taken, you answer the first question. If you answer it correctly, the test engine says, okay, I'm going to make the next one a little bit harder. If you answer it incorrectly, it says I'll make the next one a little bit easier, and so on and so forth. So adaptive implies that the test is adapting in real time to try to find that performance level of the test taker. And again, this is not new science, goes back to the late 1970s, and it is just proven that it's the more efficient way to accurately assess a student. And it kind of makes sense. If you are an awesome math performer on one of these tests, then asking you the easy math questions doesn't help me understand you at all, because you're going to get them all right. So what's the point? In order to really figure out accurately just how strong you are, I need to ask you questions that are right at your breaking point. And for that kind of student, it's really, really hard questions. So these adaptive tests basically spend more time giving each test taker questions that are appropriate to their skill levels. That's how they work. Now, one thing about this diagram on the bottom that I should say up front, this is actually not exactly how the SAT works. And the reason is, on this kind of question by question adaptive test, one of the downsides is that you cannot skip a question and come back to it later. So if you've taken the GMAT, you've taken the GRE, you will know you must answer the question in order to move forward. And it makes sense. The test engine needs to know if you got it right or not in order to figure out what to give you next. The folks who make the SAT felt that was too harsh for teenagers and said, you know what, they still need to be able to look at a question and go, I have no idea what to do here. I'm going to come back to that one later. And in order to preserve that, what they are doing is called stage adaptive. So rather than adapting every single question, they're going to give students a chunk of questions. So let's say this is the math portion of the test. They're going to give them half of the questions in that first module. It looks just like a regular test section. It's timed just like a regular section, and it's an even mixture of easy, medium, and hard. Now, to be clear on this, not every student is going to get the same questions. So they're being drawn from a massive testing bank, and these questions have been field tested, so they have a pretty accurate rendering of what's an easy, what's a medium, and what's a hard. So two students sitting next to each other still may see very different questions, but they'll be fairly evenly difficulty distributed. So you finish that first module. Behind the scenes, there is a cutoff. So there is a secret performance bar that the students don't know what it is. If you are above it, then your second module will be the harder version. And if you are below that bar, then your second module will be an easier version of module 2. So based on how you do in that first module, where we see the adaptive split is in that second half of the test. All of that then combines together to be the student's score on that test. Now, let me illustrate further. So let's say we have two students, Johnny and Jimmy, most generic name they can give. And let's say Johnny is on the top. Johnny has been diligently studying for the SAT and taking care of his nutrition and sleep and meditating. He's very mindful. He's conquered himself, whatever you want to say. He's ready to rock on this test. Jimmy has been staying up all night swapping memes on Discord and playing video games, which is much more common teenage boy behavior. And they're both going to get that first module. Nice, even mixture of easy, medium, hard. Johnny does great. Jimmy does not. You will see that Johnny's second module is now going to be mostly mediums and hards, whereas Jimmy is going to get mostly easies and mediums based on their relative performance on that first module. And when you combine that all together, you can see that Johnny had a really different difficulty distribution than Jimmy did. And with that, there are implications for score. So what we have observed is that these tend to be the score ranges that are possible based on these two pathways. So students who get sent to the harder second module will be scoring somewhere between mid 400s and a perfect score. Students that do not will not be scoring any higher than about a 600 or a 610 on this test overall. And now, when I share this, I've had a number of parents, and I think it's a human instinct that we want to give the possibility of redemption, right? This feels scary and unfair. What if my son or daughter was just a little bit fuzzy on that first module, and then you send them to the testing basement from which there is no redemption, and they may not score higher than a 580 or a 590? And the reality is, for the sort of student who would score a 710 or what have you on a paper test, they're going to have no problem clearing that performance bar and getting sent to that harder module. It's not really going to be close. The sort of student who would be right on the fence, where one day they might get sent the harder way, or if they're a little bit shaky the next day, a little bit test anxiety the next day, they get sent down this way. That's a student who's scoring about a 510, 520, 530. And you can see that that is in the overlap between those two ranges, right? So for that sort of student who's on the fence, it doesn't actually unfairly, affect them in any way. They can still score that 510 or 520 in either direction. So suffice to say, if I felt there was something, poorly designed or unfair about this design, I would tell you. The reality is it has unlocked 30% less testing time, which is huge for students, and it is accurate still the way they're doing this. So what does it mean? It does mean students need to be ready to hit the ground running. When we work with students to prepare them, a lot of folks think that all the work is on content review and drilling and time management and testing strategy, and that's all correct. But we also work with things like, hey, how are you sleeping? And what's your routine before a test? Are you struggling at all with anxiety around your performance in this test? Like, those are actually things that can really also affect performance, and especially putting students in that right mindset will help them hit the ground running and do well on that first module when they start. We have seen some students where if they're not aware of this adaptivity, they will have a little bit of a confidence challenge where they're doing great on the first module, then it gets harder and they're like, whoa, I thought I was good at math, but maybe I'm not. And they kind of check out, they disengage. So they just need to be ready for that fact. In fact, they need to be wanting the test to get harder. They need to see that as a good thing. I crave the challenge as they go. Finally, let's put it all together, and then I want to get to some of these fantastic questions, which are over here. In terms of thinking about test optional, the analogy that I use, and yes, I do live in Los Angeles, so of course it's about like freeways and off ramps and things like that, because that's where I spend most of my time stuck in traffic. I think about test optional and that decision as an off ramp, and it's an off ramp that didn't exist before. And now there is the choice to take it. And the mistakes that I see made are two. One is students will off ramp too early, and one is they will fail to off ramp when they should. And the too early off ramp is looking and saying, oh, it's optional, therefore it doesn't matter. So why waste my time on that? I'm not going to do it. And I think that is suboptimal for students who are looking to maximize their admissions chances at various schools they're applying to. In most cases, you don't want to bail too early. There are some exceptions. If you are dead set on, you're the best oboist in Northern California and you're going to go to a music conservatory, probably standardized testing doesn't matter for you in most cases, right? So there are some exceptions, but for the most part, you don't want to bail too early. The flip side would be not bailing when you should, right? So the ideal time to off ramp, if you're going to do it, is right at the point of applying. You work with, Deerfield College Advisor, make that decision. There are cases where students are very proud of their test score. They've worked hard to get to that test score, but it doesn't actually enhance their application to some of the most selective test optionals. And the right move is to apply without it. And I have seen cases where parents override that. And they're like, I think that's a myth and you got to submit it, when it was probably not a good idea to submit it. So those are the two mistakes I see most often. I think the recommendation you saw from Jamie earlier in the timeline is spot on, which is taking those practice tests, starting to get a lay of the land and make a decision about things like timeline for preparation, but not off-ramping too early or too late. Testing plan is something that every student needs to sort of put together, and it is unique for all of them. It's ideally a long-term plan. When would you make this kind of plan? I think you want to see this coming into shape by the fall of junior year, maybe as early as the summer before junior year, fall of junior year, and you're just answering these questions. Is it going to be SAT or ACT? How do I know that? Which practice tests? When am I taking them? What about my timeline for the official test? What test dates am I holding for possible retakes? Unfortunately, most students don't do their very best on their first test, so it's often going to be one or two at most retakes. What goal score do I have in mind? I've got my college list sort of comes together at that point in the process. I can start scouting and researching the kinds of scores that are likely to move the needle. Okay, that helps me understand where I'm at now for my practice tests. Preparation. How am I going to prepare? When am I going to prepare? And for every one of these questions, taking into consideration that each kid has a different life. Some of them are fall sport, spring sport, directing the play, going to be traveling all summer with parent, whatever their life looks like. You need to consider that and think about when are the pockets of time where they are less busy and not just trying to throw, oh, I heard everyone else is taking this test date, so we're going to do that. That might line up with a lot of other really, really busy and important things for your son or daughter. So just think about that uniquely. This is a sort of sample testing plan of what that might look like. Again, everyone is different, but you can see how it progresses from the start of junior year through the start of senior year with practice tests, familiarization, taking that PSAT, comparing it, figuring out the test dates and creating a prep plan where the Deerfield College Advisor is helping out with that, setting goals, working on that preparation, and then taking those official tests as you go. But again, that plan will be different for everybody. So I would love to get into the questions here. So one that just came up, 2 at most retakes. So that is, to be clear, not an official policy. So there is nothing that says you can take, and I have seen, unfortunately, students take the official SAT or ACT 6, 7, 8 times. Nothing stopping you. What I'm saying is I never recommend students take it more than 3 times total because of both the internal data that we have as well as data that College Board and ACT have published on student performance. The reality is after 3 full-length attempts at a very well-designed, standardized, equated and, test, it is there are like infinitesimally small odds that there'll be any further improvement no matter what after 3 goes at it. So yeah, to be clear, that is not a external limitation. That is me giving you my educated opinion on that it is usually not a good idea to take the test more than 3 times. So hopefully that cleared that up. I am going to start tackling all of these. Oh, I finished that one, which is good. So keep them coming. As I start to dive into these, I do want to note if you have questions that are more specific about Revolution Prep, our services, our programs, our pricing, what we offer, something specific to your son or daughter, we do have an assigned advisor. His name is Vasilios, who works, he's the only one at Revolution Prep who works with Deerfield families, has worked with a number of them over the years. That's his email, that's his phone number. One of the things we pride ourselves on is giving parents and students good counsel and guidance around standardized testing preparation, whether they work with us or not. He's somebody you can lean on and email and talk to, and he's happy to give really good advice. That sort of is what lights him up, is helping folks navigate this. So yeah, I'll leave that up for a second so you can get that, and then I will go ahead and dive into some of these fantastic questions here. So let me stop the screen share, and then we'll go into it. Okay. I'll just go in order for those who were so patient and submitted the questions earlier. Do you know how schools, if they will, superscore with paper SAT scores versus digital SAT scores? So quick definition of terms here. Superscoring is the very generous and very common policy. I think it's upwards of 93% of colleges and universities that do this, where they will mix and match different section scores from different test dates and weave them together into a Franken score. So your math from March and your reading and writing from October, we piece those together. That is the most common policy. And so this question is, for the schools that do that, will they combine between paper and digital? And the answer is yes. I know of only one school, and that is Princeton, that has come out and said, no, we will not do this. Everybody else has either come out and said, we're cool with that, or they haven't said anything, which at this point I think is a strong signal that they're going to be cool with that. They're going to superscore. So I would expect that the most common policy for those that do superscore is yes, they will mix and match between the paper and the digital. So um, next one. I've heard schools request from students who did not submit scores in their application to later submit scores after being admitted so that those scores will be included in the common data set. Is that true? How should we interpret the SAT ranges reported by colleges? So I will tell you my understanding of this with the strong caveat that I am not an admissions officer, but I do know many of them and I talk to them and I have an understanding of CDS and IPEDS and all those federal data instruments. It is true that at a lot of optional schools, even those applicants who apply without a score and are admitted, the school will then say, hey, we've admitted you, you've chosen to come here, you're enrolling. Can you please now send us a score? And the most common use for that is going to be course placement, or in some rare cases, merit aid or merit scholarships that are offered for the school based on test scores. To my understanding, they are not supposed to use those scores as part of their common data set because there's some explicit language around this, which applicant submitted and what was the submitted applicant's average. And so to my understanding, that shouldn't be happening, that they're getting it after the fact and then including it in their data set. That being said, the last question, how should we interpret SAT ranges or ACT ranges reported, is a good one. The biggest thing to note is you'll want to get the freshest data you can. So if you were to accidentally Google, whatever, NYU SAT interquartile range, and you happen to find, let's say Google had cached something from 2020 or 2019, we have seen a significant change for those schools that moved to test optional in those score ranges. And I'm sure you're not shocked to hear that they've gone up. As soon as you allow the students to choose to submit a score, we all know who's going to choose to submit a score, the strongest scorers, right? So all of those ranges have moved up. So I think what my advice, and I would certainly welcome, if Jamie wants to chime in too, but my advice would be take it at face value that these are the average scores submitted by those students who choose to submit. And that can be a signpost when you're thinking about, if I was going to apply to this test optional school and include a score, this is a sense of the students I'll be compared against. I don't know if that rings true, Jamie, in terms of how you would see it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say. And again, we'll work closely with your children to help advise them about whether to send scores or not. And that's certainly a data point that we will look at in order to make the decision. It doesn't sort of like determine it because there's a lot of factors that go into it. But yeah, we would look at the most recent data and it would be part of how we helped guide them in that decision.
Cool. Next question, which schools require to submit any and all test scores taken? So I don't have an exhaustive list handy. They exist. Georgetown is another one I know of that is like that. Again, it's the minority of schools. It's a very, very small portion of them. Interestingly, and even in most of those schools' cases where they spell that out in their admissions websites and they have that policy, they will almost always still say like, hey, we're not holding it against you and we're not judging you. We just want it for reasons, right? So I would just say in general, not a factor when you're thinking about things. It'll be the odd random school that happens to have it. But this is where doing that research as the college list comes together of what is the admissions policy around standardized testing. They're usually pretty good about spelling it out in there. So
I would strongly agree with all of that as well.
okay, good. Hey, that's good. Next question. Do you think timed essays will return to compare to potentially AI-generated application essays? Great question. Could be a whole other session, and I do a lot of talks on generative AI as well. I think there will be changes. I don't get the sense that SAT and ACT timed essays are likely going to be the likely solution to that, like resuscitating those and bringing those back in the mainstream. Maybe one signpost in certain graduate programs. I can think of, I want to say it's like UCLA Medical School. There are a few others that I know of have begun doing asynchronous video interviews where students are sent a link. They cannot prepare for the questions ahead of time. And then they're basically talking to their webcam, and in real time, they get the question, they have to react, right? So that there's no way you could punch that question into an AI. You have to just demonstrate your original thinking, your viewpoint, your personality, your rhetoric, whatever it is, right? That isn't me saying that I think everyone's going to start doing that, but that's an example of something that I have actually seen happen. It wouldn't surprise me if there's some kind of things like that, where it's live, it involves writing or speaking in a way that can't be hijacked by generative AI. I will say colleges and universities that I've spoken with, I'm doing some sessions with those admissions folks. They're being very cautious and careful and slow about this. So I wouldn't, certainly, I think even if you're a parent of a ninth or a 10th grader, I wouldn't anticipate massive changes right away. But it's worth, again, something that I know Jamie and the rest of the team at Deerfield is going to be watching, and I'm sure your children will be watching too, is how those things might subtly change. But yeah, hard to say. I'll let Jamie answer the next one. Can the Deerfield College Advising Office remind us when students take the PSAT at Deerfield? Is it this spring?
This is a great question. We actually run it in October. It's usually on a Saturday. We don't do test or school day testing, so it'll be on a Saturday. Sometimes it's even during Parents Weekend. And for juniors, I believe that the policy is still we opt juniors into it automatically, and then they can opt out. For 10th graders, they would have to opt in. So if you have a current ninth grader and you'd like them to try it next year, just make sure they opt in. And for if you'll have a junior next year, then I think it should be automatic. But you'll get lots of communications from this from our testing coordinators.
Cool. Thank you. Next question. Do colleges see all tests or only the one you submit? Can you submit verbal and math from different SAT test dates? So again, this is going to vary pretty widely. The most common situation is going to be you're able to use, actually SAT and ACT have like built-in features where you can submit a super score, a score choice they call it, or you can submit a patchwork for the schools that allow that. So the most common situation is that no, colleges will not see all the different tests that you took. As mentioned earlier, there are a small handful who insist on, we do need to see your full testing transcript as you go. But yeah, that answered that question. Do colleges have preferences? Paper, ACT versus digital SAT? No, not at all. They truly don't care. And in fact, it's an interesting thing, maybe worth noting, interesting to me anyway. For students and maybe for parents, this whole digital thing has been a big hubbub. If you talk to folks that are admissions offices, they don't care. They have been shown reams of data from College Board showing how the digital test is statistically identical to the paper SAT, to the point where they are like, what change? Who cares? It's just the SAT with some other bells and whistles, but the data is identical to them. So, and as you know, college admissions offices are dealing with a lot of other major external factors and changes right now. So they actually don't care at all about that transition, and they definitely don't prefer between the two. This actually, next point is a fair one, that ACT and SAT ranges reported are for enrolled in the CDS. That is correct. My understanding, though, is that the rules behind the data, and again, it is a fair point to note that maybe not everybody is following this, are that they're only supposed to include that test score if that enrolled student included it as part of their application, not if they gave it as a supplement after being extended admission and after choosing to enroll. That being said, are there some who might be doing it either on purpose or not? Maybe, but my understanding is they're not supposed to be doing that. But that is a fair point. The data is all around enrolled. I heard the first, and I'm gonna. I think there's a typo in this question. I'm pretty sure. Heard the first digital ACT. I think that should say digital SAT was much harder than the practice test. However, wouldn't this not really matter because scores are scaled anyways? Great question, and yes, you're right. So we sent a couple of folks to go take the first national digital test date on March 9th, and it is true that specifically the second harder math module for both of our test takers, and as widely reported by students on the internet, if you want to go read what teenagers have to say, yes, it was harder than the 4 sample practice tests that the College Board provided on their Blue Book app. But you are absolutely right. There was a huge fear about this. How dare you, College Board? The reality is their equating process operates. Equating is their version of curving. It's not the same as doing a curve, but we can think of it as sort of like that. It's how they make sure that a 750 is a 750 is a 750 across test dates. It exactly nullifies the fact that this test might have been harder than the practice test or harder than today's school day test that was given across the country, because it will end up being, hey, to get a 750, you needed to answer fewer questions on that other test date. So this is something that students tend to obsess about a lot over the years is, I heard this was the easier test date or the harder test date. all bogus. And again, I understand why emotionally teenagers would go down those routes, but it's just not the way the science works behind the testing. They should feel very safe taking whatever test date, and if it was objectively harder, the equating process will mean a change to how the scoring is done that counterbalances the fact that it was harder. So well done. And then I'll let Jamie handle this last one. Is there an official practice test for the ACT like that of the PSAT at Deerfield?
Great question. So there is not, it's just, they don't really have the same sort of infrastructure for a practice ACT. But what I will say is that we work with Revolution Prep, who offers these like online proctored exams. They're every Saturday and then one Sunday a month, and they're free. The website, which I can put in the next family FYI, that for Revo, you can just register for them there. So those are a great opportunity to practice. The ACT we definitely recommend, like Ben said, to take a practice ACT when you're taking the PSAT or a practice SAT, so you can compare scores. And you can also, if you can't do the online live proctored one, there's ways to download them. So definitely want people to be doing those practices, but there's not the same sort of like test company infrastructure for practice ACT as there is for the PSAT.
Spot on. And I will just note, if you do have your son or daughter do a free practice test with us, we use only retired, former administered ACTs, right? So it's not tests that we create, it's actual ones that have been given. So they are getting a really good, accurate representation of what that real ACT is like. All right, that was an awesome set of questions.
It was.
And I do a lot of these,
802.
so I'm not just saying that. That was a really good set of questions. So anytime we're talking about the common data set and enrolled versus admitted, we've gotten to an awesome group of questions. So I just want to say thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Deerfield parents, for the opportunity to share this. I really hope that the information I had was valuable. And yeah, I'll turn it back to Jamie to close us out.
Great. Well, Ben, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing all of your depth of knowledge with us. And certainly, if you guys have questions, you can email advising@deerfield.edu. We're always happy to answer things. And we thank you for being here tonight. And we hope you have a lovely evening. Thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jamie.
Bye, guys.